John Pijanowski received his bachelor's degree from Brown, his PhD from Cornell. He's co-authored more than 25 publications and written a book, Professional Responsibility in Ethics for Educators. So that's really quite an impressive little background, along with 20 years of experience as an educator. And currently, Dr. Pijanowski works with master's and doctoral students, preparing them to serve as researchers and educational leaders, which is exactly what we do in our EDD program. Dr. Pijanowski has designed several ethics courses to include moral mind in action, moral courage, teaching character, and leadership ethics. Two of the parts of the presentation today are particularly exciting because one is dealing with building moral habits that are critical for realizing moral courage in moments of crisis. And I'm quite sure there's never been a time that we've needed more understanding of how to stand up and have some moral courage in moments of crisis, as well as the second piece of his process today, which is dealing with the decision-making process, something that we speak about quite a bit in the EDD program, to include barriers of successfully negotiating moral dilemmas. The Union Institute, of course, is a distance education institute, so that the emphasis Dr. Pijanowski has in integrating technology into his college teaching and a focus on evaluating the value-added impact technology has on student learning is really very important to us. On a completely separate note, it's nice to know that Dr. Pijanowski has areas of expertise that actually match what we do in our EDD. We have two areas of specialization, educational leadership and higher ed. And Dr. Pijanowski comes with a background in both of those areas. He was a teacher, a principal, and a superintendent. One of our faculty always refers to himself as a recovering superintendent. In higher ed, Dr. Pijanowski has already been an associate dean and has extensive online experience, and that's really important to us. Additionally, I did take some time to read your article, Dr. Pijanowski, defining moral leadership in graduate schools of education in the Journal of Leadership Education. And one of the things you do that's absolutely thrilling to our faculty, not only your extensive writing on moral leadership for our learners, but our faculty has been doing something similar to what you have done, which was to include the influence of accreditation standards while incorporating an emphasis on moral school leadership. And you looked at accrediting bodies such as ISLAC, NCATE, AACTE, the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Ed, and UCEA, University Council for Ed Administration. And you took time in that article to explain how these organizations incorporated moral leadership in their higher ed graduate program assessment criteria. And we are doing something very similar in all of our EDD seminars and courses. We're incorporating the new advanced leadership propositions from National Board, 3 of which parallel social justice. So we're really sort of in the same place in terms of what we're doing in our program and your experiences. So I'm very thrilled that you're here to speak with us today. Just to give you one more sentence, our first semester in the EDD program, 2 of the 3 courses deal with ethical leadership and education and social justice. So you come to us with parallel experience, and we're really excited. And you and I have been having this conversation for a year, and so I turn the program over to you, and cannot tell you how thrilled I am that you're here. Thank you. Would you begin?
Thank you, Arlene, for that introduction, and to all of you for being here today to spend some time with me talking about my greatest professional passion, which is talking about moral leadership and moral decision-making. I want to say just right off the top how impressed I've been with my interactions with Union so far, and with the people and the program. It's been a great experience, so I'm excited to be here. I do want to just add one little piece of my background to give you a little introduction to why I think about these issues the way I do, and then we'll dive right in and have what I hope is a fairly interactive dialogue, either with you being able to share some of your ideas through some little quizzes or the chat box that I have there, or just thinking on your own and reflecting on some of the things I'm saying. My academic experience, I started when I went to college studying psychology. And I had no idea what I was going to do with a degree in psychology. I just was interested in it, and I thought maybe I'd want to work directly with people, maybe in counseling. And I got really hooked into developmental and experimental psych. And graduated, and really, again, I had no idea still after 4 years of studying and working really hard of what it was I was going to do with that degree. So I found myself accidentally in a classroom, and I became a teacher. And after teaching for a while, I became really frustrated by what I saw as some gross inequities among children within classrooms, across schools and districts. And I developed some passion around that and realized if I wanted to affect any kind of change scale that I was interested in affecting change, I had to know where the money was. I had to understand how to get the money and how to get it in the right hands and distribute it better. And so graduate school was the place for us to learn about that. And I started studying economics of education, leadership, ed finance. And so I tell that because when I look at moral issues, I don't just think about it from a philosophical perspective. I don't think about it just as the should of morality or the should of ethics, what we should do. But I'm really interested in the how and the why. And I'm interested in the how mostly from that psychological perspective that I learned when I was an undergrad and still spent a lot of time sort of steeped in that literature. And I think about the why from the perspective of behavioral economics and how people respond to different incentives that they're constantly bombarded with in their lives, both personal and professional. And you'll see some of those influences coming out in the talk today and in the conversations that we're going to be having. So first, I just want to set the day up for you a little bit and talk about what my goals are. One thing I want to do is talk about the stages of moral decision-making. We're going to spend some time using a few simple moral dilemmas to structure a dialogue around not just what we do at the end of a moral problem, but when we're faced with a moral problem, what are the different components of wrestling that problem to the ground? And coming to some conclusion about how we're going to deal with it, and then what we do with our own response to moral problems. And part of that is becoming more aware of what the obstacles are once we've decided what we should do to actually doing it. And this, more than anything, is at the crux of my research and my interest is that gap that often exists between judgment and action. And so we'll dive into what happens in that gap. We'll spend some time talking about traditionally what are the things that the research tells us are the major obstacles to moral action, and hopefully I'll get you to reflect a little bit on some of your own obstacles that you've experienced. We'll also reason through some moral dilemmas together, and I'll be curious to see if some of these are familiar to you or not, or if they're all new. And then this last part, which sometimes catches people a little off guard, is to appreciate what can be learned from moral failure. You'll notice that was in my title, and I'm a big fan of failure. I think that failure is underestimated as a learning mechanism. I think it's critically important that we embrace our failure. I don't mean that to say we should try to do more of it, but we should embrace it and try to better understand it, spend time processing it. But often what happens is the opposite of that. Oftentimes when we're faced with moral failure, our response is to run away from it, to try to rationalize it, or to find excuses that allow us to not process it in the moment and then forget about it. So again, I'll be talking about some of the research behind what we know about moral failure, as well as talking about it in practice a little bit. and hopefully think about your own moral failure. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to share with you a really simple dilemma just to get people thinking. First I want to just take the temperature of the classroom. I'm assuming that because you're all used to being online that you know how to set your status with either an agree or disagree, that green check and that X disagree under the attendee list. So how many of you have ever heard of the trolley dilemma? If you have, give me the green check, and if you haven't, give me the red X. Okay, good. A few of you haven't done it yet, so if you're having a hard time finding it, it's just at the top left of your screen under where it says My Status, and there's a little drop-down arrow, and you can click that drop-down arrow, and you can just click on the red X or the green check. I asked you that question for a couple reasons. One, I wanted to get you playing around with your computer screen because I'm going to ask you to do that quite a bit today. And the other is I just wanted to see how many of you are comfortable or how many of you have heard this story before. So most of you haven't. So the trolley dilemma is a classic, very simple moral dilemma that's used to start conversations like this. It's not something I created, obviously. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to imagine yourself as you walk upon a set of trolley tracks. And then from one direction, you see coming quickly towards you a trolley, an out-of-control trolley. As you go down and see where those tracks are leading, you see 5 people tied to the tracks. 5 people that will surely die if that trolley continues on its path and ends up hitting those people. However, just before those people are tied up, you see that the track splits. And off on the split, there's one person who's tied to the trolley track. In front of you, you see a lever. Now, if you pull that lever, you will divert the trolley away from the 5 people and towards the one, surely killing that one person. So the question I have for you is, would you pull the lever? And you'll notice that there's a question pod sort of right in the middle bottom here where you can answer yes or no. So go ahead and do that for me now and submit your results.
Horrible question.
Not working. It's not working.
It's not working.
Go ahead.
It's not allowing me.
Now, it's not unusual. If you have an answer that you haven't answered yet, please try to submit it if you can. Whenever I ask this question in front of a class, I always get it to about half the people don't answer. And sometimes it's online, it's because there's some technical issues they're working out. But even when there are no technical issues, a lot of people shy away from answering this question. So far, we've got a pretty strong majority of you would pull the lever. So what I want to do is first I want to talk to those people who would not pull the lever. And I want to ask you why. So if you could, for some of you who would choose not to pull the lever, if you could go into the chat box, which should be right below me, I'd like you to chat in some of your thoughts about why you would not pull that lever. Well, you know, people actually come up with that all the time. So this is the bargaining part of the moral dilemma, where there's got to be some other way. Some people would say there's got to be another lever. I'm sure some of you might be thinking, would it be possible that I could jump down and quickly run over and untie those people? And because I'm the moderator here and I get to decide what happens or not, I get to tell you that no, you don't have time to do that, and no, there's not that other option to pull the lever and get it to stop. But I appreciate your ingenuity. Let me ask the people who would pull the lever. And this is where I really want the conversation to kick in, because I think we're going to have a fairly decent sized conversation about this. For those who would pull the lever, why would you? Okay. All right. Save more people. So basically you're telling me that it's just better to have, yeah. Okay, so far all the answers coming in are basically, it's basically about the math. Yeah. Yeah, right. Again, the impact on the fatalities, they'll have more on the family. So what I'm hearing here is that for most of you, it's all about the math. Could I get one of the tech moderators to clear the all the checks and X's? Usually I can do that myself, but I don't seem to have that available to me. Right. Okay. So let me ask you this question then. If you could, just changing your status again with the green X and the green check or the red X, how many of you then say it's about the math? That basically it's a mathematical equation and the opportunity to save 4 lives in the total math is the reason you're doing it. If that's why you're doing it, give me a green check. Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be where people are landing. All right. Now there's another question I want to ask you as you think about this. So just to recap, so most of you would pull the lever. And the overwhelming majority of you, in fact, I didn't hear any other answers, the reason you would do it is because of the math. There's a utilitarian argument at play here that if you have the opportunity to essentially save 4 lives in sum by sacrificing 1 so that 5 can live, that's the right decision to make. Now, what other information do you wish that you had? So is there something that you wish you knew about the context? Is there something that you wish you knew about the people? And if so, what kinds of questions would you ask? Okay, why were they tied to the track? Who are the people? And why would either of those things matter? Try to give me a little bit more on that. So under what circumstances would who they are matter to you?
Exactly.
Who would they have to be for you to do something different? Okay, was it a personal choice? Did they choose to be tied there? Were they criminals? Okay, so if they were criminals, okay, or terrorists or something like that, that would matter less. So essentially when we're doing the math, we're also adding some multipliers in front of the variables. So if they were bad people, then maybe it would be a fraction in front of the variables. In other words, maybe we would value them less. Is there a contextual question? Is there something bigger that's sort of hanging over us that we don't know about? So that it's something that we need to gather more information. Suzanne is coming in and saying that maybe it doesn't matter so much who they are. They still have families. What about that family? What if one of them was your spouse? What about the age? What if some of them were very old and some of them were very young? Might that matter to you? Great. Okay. So what we're doing here is we're not just, it was a math problem at first. And then it was a math problem that we kind of made more complicated. The calculus started to not just value 5 versus 1, but for some of you, and I will note that some of you are saying that it doesn't matter or it shouldn't matter. But for some of you, you're starting to prioritize. You're starting to determine that, well, we don't value each life the same. Maybe age matters, as was just mentioned here by Lisa. Maybe whether they're a good person or a bad person matters. Maybe your affiliation with them matters. Maybe the fact that they're a loved one versus a stranger. All those things are factors. Okay. Well, let's use this to talk about the math and how it plays out by looking at the different stages of decision making. Right? The first one I want to talk about is perception. Okay, when we talk about perception, this is all part of this general kind of sensitivity that we have to what's happening. And perception is the initial ability to recognize that there is in fact a problem, that something needs to be addressed right here. People are generally pretty good at perceiving when a problem exists. But there are obstacles that get in our way even of perceiving that there's a problem. Now, in this case, if we go back and think about the trolley dilemma, if you walk up to those trolley tracks, can you think of some things that might get in the way, some things that might make it harder for you to even to know that there's a problem going on? And while a lot of you are typing, I'll start to offer some of the ones that often come up when we're having these kinds of conversations. Maybe you have your iPod. It could be something that simple. Maybe you're reading the newspaper. For those of you who actually still like the feel of old newspaper print in your hand, you're texting, right? Or you're lost in conversation, or you're stressed out about the day that's to come, or you didn't sleep very well. All these things these very simple behavioral issues can get in the way of you even perceiving that there's a problem going on. But generally, when something like this is happening, people tend to be fairly good at perceiving it, and even though they do that, they oftentimes struggle with interpreting. So, right, maybe there's some physical issues, blind, by the way. So when you're interpreting, then you're trying to understand what exactly is happening here. And you brought that up as a group. Some of you even mentioned that, well, in fact, there are some problems with interpreting the dilemma that I gave you. There's a broader context going on. Why are those people tied to the tracks? What is it that we should know about what's going on here? For those of you who maybe spend a lot of time in Southern California or in New York City, you might see something like this going on in New York, and your first thought is, wow, this is some sort of, improv acting troupe who's putting on some sort of show to test this. We're going to be on YouTube later. Depending on your context, you may have a different sense of the kinds of reasons something really dramatic or strange like this might be happening. Or you might be trying to interpret, did they put themselves there? If somebody else put them there, why? And all those are very complicated to process in a short period of time. And then you start to judge, okay? The judgment is when you start to address that there are lots of different things that could happen. Do I have time to jump on the trolley and take control of it? Is there a second lever? Do I have time to run down there and untie those people? Or maybe you decided that you can't do any of those things. And what you're looking at now is, what happens if I pull the lever, and what happens if I don't? And at that time, you're weighing what's the best course of action. And the judgment might be, for some of you, that I pull the lever because I'm saving lives. And for some of you, it's to not, because every life is valuable, and you can't be the one who makes that final decision. But you choose the best course of action. But then there's another critical stage that comes into play here, and that's prioritization. And that's where you begin to look at all the things that you value, the things that you value that are coming down to bear on this moment, and you have to determine, which of those things do I value the most? Now, for some of you, it could be that you value the utilitarian morality of saving more lives. And that's overwhelming to you. And you prioritize that value. Some of you may prioritize the guilt that you would feel for sacrificing the life of that one person. And you prioritize that. Others would prioritize the law. Might process, well, do I legally have a right to make this decision? And that might drive your decision making. So you look at all these things that you value, and they compete with each other. And independently, they're all valid. But when they come together, you have to prioritize and make a choice. And courage is that moment where you act, where you look at those things that you value, and you look at the consequences of following through on that priority, and you either do or you do not act on it. And we'll spend a little bit more time today talking about courage. Other people call it implementation. And for those of you who are familiar with Jim Rest's work, who's now deceased but was a faculty member at University of Minnesota for many years, you'll notice that a lot of his components of moral decision-making are embedded into these stages I'm talking about today. Then you've done it, and you begin to reflect. You begin to reflect about what's going on in that moment. You think about it. And then the meta-reflection or metacognitive process is where you think about your own thinking. And that's what we're doing today, is we're not just doing something and then reflecting back on it, but we're reflecting on the process. Why did we do what we did? Why did we prioritize the way we did? What got in the way of us acting on that priority? That got in the way of us acting with moral courage, implementing what we wanted to. And what do we think about what we think? And that's where learning really happens. Okay. Let's move on to something called the footbridge dilemma. Okay. Now, for those of you who were familiar with the trolley dilemma, you're probably also familiar with the footbridge dilemma. And so let's talk about that. But let me take a break right now because we got a question. How can you have a moral conversation with ourselves when we need to react in a split second? Yeah. I think that there are two different answers to that question that I want to talk about, and it'll be a theme that runs through the rest of this talk. One of them is that a lot of times in moments you don't have that opportunity to have a conversation with yourself, and then other times we do. This is the part that Arlene mentioned in the introduction about building habits. When we're faced with that moment of crisis, and it's upon us, and we have to act in a split second, we don't fall back on the process that I just laid out for you. We fall back on our habits, those things that are tested and tried over time, those things that we feel comfortable with. And sometimes this moral process is ingrained in us because we've reflected on it, and we sort of built it into the habits that we have. And other times, it's that pressure or that value that seems to be most recent or pressing on us as most urgent in a moment that drives our decision. Now, I don't want to make it seem like I think that every time something like this happens, what I mean by that is a moral crisis. Hopefully you never have to pull a lever because of a trolley speeding down towards you. But when these things happen, that you will fall back those habits, that you can hone those habits over time, and that you hone them by the way that you address the way that these decisions happen, the way that these components of the decision played out in these moments. And hopefully we'll have a chance today to talk about some very difficult moments that are common to a lot of us, and some that are incredibly simple that we may not think of as moral problems. It's a good question. I'm glad that you asked it. So let's move to another dilemma. So I want you to imagine yourself stepping onto a platform, and you're looking down over trolley tracks. And once again, a trolley is speeding out of control from one direction, from your right to your left. And as you look down the track, you see that at the end of the track, there are 5 people who are tied to that track. However, at the very edge of the platform, peering over with half a foot actually stepping off of the platform, practically just peering over and leaning, you see an incredibly large man. And you know, because I'm telling you, you know that if you were to just oh so gently nudge that fan, it would fall onto the track, derailing the trolley, killing the man that was nudged over to the track, but saving the 5 lives who were tied up at the end of the track. Now, the question I have for you is, would you push the man? So you'll see that I've opened up a pod. And if you would just go ahead and respond, I'll give you a little bit of a minute to think about it and respond as quickly as you can. Wow. So that's different. Let me ask you a question. When I asked you to do this before, you told me it was the math. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I just gave you the same math. In the first one, 5 people were going to die. You do something, pull the lever, and 1 person dies instead. 5 people's lives are saved. In this one, 5 people are going to die. You do something, you nudge the man. 5 people's lives are saved, and 1 person dies. So why did you flip? Christy, I saw that comment. I'm going to get to it in a minute.
You go wrong and kill the ball. I'm sorry.
All right, good. Okay, so some of these are kind of, you know, the bargaining part again, which is normal. And some of them I think are a little confused on the similarities, so I'm going to push you a little bit on it. Okay. Now, so for some of you, you were bargaining a little bit. Maybe I could drive on myself. Maybe I could ask him. I really like that one. Sort of engage in some sort of democratic process. Let's take a vote on the platform, or ask the person, are you willing to do this? Those kinds of things. And some of you are still trying to add some more calculus to the math. But for others, I just want to make it really clear that it really is just the same. It is the same math. The 1 person who was tied to the track that you pulled the lever and diverted the train wasn't going to die otherwise. In fact, if it was morning, they wouldn't even get a sunburn. The trolley would continue. The 5 people would die. You would go down. You would untie the 1 person, and they would go on with their lives. The same thing with the person on the platform. They weren't going to die either, but their boat is somewhat similar. The thing that I'm seeing coming up the most, and if you're reading this chat along, I think you'll see it too. There's a theme about just directly pushing the person, more directly involved, actually putting hands on them. If these things seem to matter to you, let me see if I can address that. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the old game Donkey Kong, but imagine that, like in the game Donkey Kong, there's a stack of barrels sort of at the back edge of the platform against the wall. And there's a lever right in front of the barrels. And this will work because I'm telling you it'll work, and just assume that you know it will work. If you pull that lever, those barrels will start to roll, and the first barrel in line will clip that large man in the heel and knock him onto the track, derailing the trolley, killing him, and saving the 5 lives. So I'm curious, would that make a difference? Would it make a difference for anybody? It seems like the group has spoken. All right. Well, I feel like yeah. See, it seems like you're a bunch of flip-floppers now. So let's stay focused. You said it was the math. Then you say it's not the math. Then you say it's because you're putting hands on them and you're actually intimately involved. Now I'm telling you it's exactly the same. You're still just pushing a lever. You push the lever one time, one person dies. You push the lever another time, one person dies, and it still doesn't matter. So you tell me what's going on here. What's really different?
Direct.
Jim asked if the person would fight back, and that's why I put him so precariously on the edge. So just step up behind him and just nudge him. So it's the direct violence. It's the direct involvement. It's the personal involvement. Well, I think y'all are actually spot on. I think you're doing a good job of being in touch with what's going on. It's real, obviously, how we talk about these things is a little bit different in a setting like this than it would be if you're actually in the moment. We can talk about what we think we would do in the moment when we're here. It's different to think about what would actually happen with all the stress of that moment on you. But still, I think it's interesting that even within this environment, there's something about that feeling, that personal involvement feeling, that's changing the way that you would respond to this question. Now, there's been some interesting research coming out of Harvard where they've actually looked at how the brain responds when people reason through the trolley dilemma and the footbridge dilemma. And there's activity in the emotional center of the brain when people are working through the footbridge dilemma that is not happening when people are working through the trolley dilemma. There's affect. There's emotion. There's a connectivity to that person that makes it different. Now, I raise this for 2 points, and I think they're both pretty important. One is that affect as information matters. So a lot of times when we think about how we're supposed to deal with moral problems, if we're running a business or we're running a school, you learn that at some point along the way that you have to distance yourself a little bit to make these cold, calculated moral decisions if you really want to do what's right. Now, I may be preaching to the choir here, but I'll say it anyway. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with it mainly because it can't be done. Affect is ever present. Emotion is ever present. And just as you saw here, even a manufactured affect, like the one I gave you by flipping these 2 dilemmas, was enough to completely flip the group's answer. They completely move from doing one thing to doing the complete opposite. So if that's true, imagine how powerful it actually is in that moment, in real life. Affect as information matters, just like all the other information that we're gathering when we're making decisions. It's critically important to embrace it, to know when it's coming, and to be able to process it in a way that matters. But there's another reason why I think it's important to compare these two. The reason that it was more personal is because that person was one of you. There he was on the platform with you. You had things in common. You were both in the same place. Presumably, you were both about to try to get on a similar trolley. Maybe you were going to the same place. You were there at the same time. Maybe you had similar schedules. All of those are not details that I gave you, but all those things are the kind of imagery that gets processed subconsciously. There's an affiliation that gets created with that person. The person who was tied to that tracks, well, you've never been tied to tracks before. You weren't tied to the tracks in the moment. You're probably not the kind of person that would ever do something to get yourself tied up to those tracks. That's a different person. That's another. That kind of connection makes a critically important difference, both the distance in space and the distance in community. Makes it easier to sacrifice one than one of us. I think that's, again, it's information to have, it's information to understand when we're trying to process how would we respond in a moral context. How do we see those people that we're making decisions about? Do we see them as one of us, or do we see them as one of them? And how does that affect the way that we decide? Again, simple ideas, but ideas I think worth exploring. Okay, so I want to move on and talk about prioritization of values a little bit more, because I think that's really at the heart of the conversation I want to have. But let me first ask, does anybody have any questions about what we've talked about so far that you want to throw in the chat? If you do, feel free and I'll try to address them. Oh, more information about the Harvard study. Well, I can do a couple of things about that. One of the things I can do is I can talk to you a little bit about it more now, but I can also provide a link to the study itself, and Arlene could share that with the group. So at the Harvard study, what they were trying to do is, and this is, I think, important. We think about morality, a lot of times we start with philosophy. And we use philosophical ideas to maneuver our way through moral problems. But we're learning more and more about the behavioral neuroscience behind a lot of what we do, and ethics and moral decision making included. So there's a whole body of research that's trying to understand how different parts of the brain are triggered when working through different kinds of moral problems. Now, this particular study is a bit older, and it was really just looking at increased activity, so increased synaptic activity, what's going on in different regions of the brain. And we've done a fairly good job of mapping the brain in kind of gross sort of ways. And so we understand emotional centers of the brain, for example, and we can try to target them and understand when activity is going on there. So in this particular study, they're simply trying to understand if there's enhanced activity, if the mental process is trying to trigger or tap into that emotional element, that emotional process, as you're working through the problem. And they in advance, they had a theory that in fact that was the differences between the footbridge and the trolley. Which, if you ever teach this, I can tell you that I probably taught the trolley and the footbridge dilemma maybe 3 dozen times by now. And it's always the same. Basically, around the same percentage of people respond one way, about the same percentage of the group respond the other. The reasons are exactly the same. The bargaining is exactly the same. And this group is no different. This is how the human animal tends to process these problems. And because of that, because it's such a well-established dilemma discussion, it's a good touchstone to use for branching out into other parts of science and understanding how it works. All right, well, let me ask you, I'm going to talk about another story. And I call it a loved one left behind. How many of you, if do me a favor and use your status with your green checks and red X's. Give me a green check if you've ever gone through Disney leadership training, and a red X if you have not.
Did you say Disney?
Yeah, Disney. Like Disney.
Oh, okay. I was just checking.
Yeah. I see that James Henderson had raised his hand. Was that an accident, or did James want to say something?
No, I clicked on the wrong thing at first, John. I've got my X up now.
Okay, great. Okay, so it looks like just about nobody is, we have one person maybe who's done some Disney training, maybe two. Well, maybe for those of you who have, this story will be familiar to you. It's a story that I picked up. I've never done the Disney training myself, but as a dean, I used to manage some Disney training on our campus. So it's about a family who goes to visit Disney World, and they have a great time, they have a great trip, and they're heading home, and they're already on the airplane on their way home, and then all of a sudden they realize that they, like happens so many times when families visit Disney World, they've left a loved one behind. In this case, it's a stuffed bunny. And so the young daughter is just distraught that they're left behind. And so there's nothing they can do. They're on the plane, they're headed home, and it was a sad ending to what had been a great trip. Now, go back to the resort. They had been staying in one of the resort hotels, and there's a housekeeper who's working through cleaning up the rooms, and they get to this room, and this housekeeper happens upon the stuffed bunny who's left in the resort hotel room. Now, I'd like you to respond in the chat. Don't necessarily go to what should happen, but just think about what could happen. So what are the different possible actions that housekeeper can take? What might that housekeeper do once they come upon this bunny? Okay, so the first one to enter in would be to turn in the bunny. So take the bunny, I guess, to Lost and Found. Yeah, good. What else could they do? Actually go that extra step to actually, find out who stayed in that room and make sure that now those actually are all great examples of what could happen there. And I want to use this to talk about what we call schema theory. Okay? Now, schema theory helps us understand a little bit about what some of the pressures are that help us prioritize values. The first one is personal interest. Now, personal interest develops very early on. It's how children begin to see the world. It's the schema that they use. And generally speaking, there's really no sort of larger sociocentric perspective. Basically, personal interest is driven just as the term seems to state. How can I best gain from this situation? And a personal interest perspective here was shared by some of you. It's the easiest thing is to do nothing, or maybe the other personal interest I would have besides not having to do any extra work might be to actually have a free bunny to give to my own kid, to give to a favorite niece or something like that. Now the next one is maintaining norms. Maintaining norms kind of fits in with what most of you said first. Maintaining norms is about following the rules. At its most extreme, people who are trapped in sort of a maintaining norms schema tend to find it very difficult to imagine any kind of order in the world without actually having rules to follow. And they're fairly dogmatic about those rules. So in this case, this would be turning it into lost and found. I'm sure that's part of the normal procedure that a housekeeper would have when they find a bunny like this. Maybe it would be taking that extra step. I mean, it is Disney after all, to find out who was actually staying there and send it to them. As it turns out, they didn't really do either of those things. What happened was that there's a question. It's thinking of the kid that lost the bunny considered a personal interest. Christy, it's a great question. I'm going to get back to that in just a second. Hold on to that. So what they did at Disney was they actually, the housekeeper went to the manager, and the manager gave the housekeeper a little voucher to go to the gift shop and get one of those disposable cameras. You know, the ones that they cost 50 cents to make and they charge you $20 at the gift store at Disney. So get one of those and gave them about an hour or so off of work and sent them on a mission. So what they did is the housekeeper got the bunny, got the camera, and took pictures of the bunny sitting at a table with other stuffed animals, having a tea party, hanging out with Mickey Mouse on the front of a roller coaster. Put them all together in a little picture book with a note attached. Sent the picture book and the bunny back to the kid, and the note said, "Sorry I was so late getting home. I was having too much fun with my friends."
Oh, that's cute.
Now, let's think about that a moment. Right? What are the benefits of doing that versus the cost? Let's just think about it from strictly just a cost-benefit perspective. Why do that? Sure, marketing. Hey, the marketing continues. I've told this story at least 24 times. Sure. Moral satisfaction. And to build positive relationships. I think all those are good answers, and they're right. Does anybody happen to know what the working mission statement is at Disney? I mean, organizations have mission statements that are sometimes a paragraph or a page long, and nobody knows what they are. Okay, but then sometimes they have a working mission statement. Here at the University of Arkansas, it's students first. So students first is that working mission statement that people kind of carry around in their head. Does anybody know what the one at Disney is? And by the way, Tina and Maxine's comments are, I think, fit well within that mission statement. All right, I'll tell you. It's "We make magic happen." I think that would be a great mission statement for a school, by the way, but that's a different lecture. So, we make magic happen. Now here it is. A moment comes upon this manager and this housekeeper. They've got this bunny. Sure, they could send it back, and that would be following the rules, and that would be the right thing to do. Would that be magical? It'd be nice. You know, it'd be good customer service, and it would be a classy act to do. But would it be magical? With the 50 cents and 1 hour of a housekeeper's time, and then a stamp, basically they made magic happen for that kid, and also for the institution. Okay? So in that moment, what turned out to be a really bad thing turned out to be this magical thing that fed into the mission of the organization. Now, is that necessarily defining post-conventional sort of in the strictest terms? Well, probably not. Post-conventional is a little bit more complicated than that. But I use this simple story to try to send this idea of this broader sort of moral criteria beyond just following the rules, to look for ways that you can put this larger organizational good that we've all accepted, this idea of making magic happen, and trying to have it permeate all of our actions and behaviors, to try to find these sort of unconventional ways to make magic happen in this case. Well, you can also do that within terms of making moral decisions. So how might we move beyond the rules with moral primacy? and find ways to make the most moral thing happen. In this way, you're appealing to an ideal. You're not just rejecting the status quo for the sake of it. You're not being unconventional just for the sake of being unconventional, but because you're appealing to an ideal that's stronger, that's bigger than what the rules might offer as guide. Okay, so what I want to do is spend a little bit of time now talking to you about moral failure. And to do that, I want to talk about why we fail, and I want to spend talking about sometimes why we continue to fail. And to do that first, I'll step back and talk about those people who act with moral courage and what we know about them. The first thing is that there's been some interesting research, and Larry Walker is probably the one who's done the most interesting research, I think, on moral exemplars. People, traditionally, historically, have been identified as acting with moral courage. And these moral exemplars, they tend to exhibit some similar characteristics, both in their past and in their current behavior. One of the things that moral exemplars tend to have is they tend to have a prevalence of helpers in their early life, particularly relative to the number of enemies that they have. Now, that might seem like common sense, but I think it's important to recognize when we put ourselves in a situation as educators and think about the value it is of early helpers. We know that. We know that having strong attachments at an early age matter. We know that having helpers in our lives matter. But there's also been research that shows that it not only matters for your ability to develop strong ego integrity and your ability to show confidence and to succeed in educational attainment, jobs, but also matters in your later ability to wrestle moral dilemmas and to make good decisions as you get older in life. Another thing that we find about moral exemplars is that they have a tremendous capacity to transform critical life events. Many of the people, and this is kind of a serendipitous finding in Larry Walker's research, but many of the people that they found as moral exemplars had experienced significant life events that they had transformed, including the death of children. That somehow they had taken that horrible life event and they found the capacity to turn it into something useful or positive in their lives later. And that carried throughout the rest of their lives, to take that grief and turn it into an energy that they were able to use. And this is at least the way that they self-reported. A third critical element of these moral exemplars is the balance between agency and communion. Now, for any of you who have ever worked with teenagers, this will be really easy for you to grasp this idea that as you develop throughout your youth, there are two things that you're wrestling with: your own individual agency, your independence, your confidence, and then your communion, the way that you relate to other people, the importance of your connections with other people. And that, again, if you've worked with adolescents, it's very easy to see how being out of balance in either of those things can be very dangerous. Those people who they're very strong in their individual agency, but they're weak in their communion. They're weak in their affiliations with other people. They don't necessarily care about other people. They don't necessarily act in ways that fit social norms because they're not trying to build friendships and relationships. They're very egocentric. And on the other side, those people who are completely focused on their communion and not at all on their individual agency. Weak ego integrity. Most of their behaviors and actions are driven towards trying to build relationships with other people. They're very, I'll let that pass, yeah. They're very quick to give in to peer pressures. They're very easily, so when they get put down, they very easily for their own self-esteem to be shattered and to crumble, and So they tend to be weak in those areas. They tend to be easily pulled in one direction or another. Agency and communion being in balance with each other, again, is a critical element of these moral exemplars. And then the fourth piece is that they identify their own moral self as a key component of their individual ego. And so their ego integrity is tied to their moral integrity. And when they act in a way that damages their moral integrity, they feel that it's an attack on their own identity of self. It's harder for them to compartmentalize their moral selves. Now, again, I got a question before asking for more information about the Harvard study. If any of you are interested in the Larry Walker study, there's one paper in particular. I'm happy to make those links available and share with the group. So after the talk, I can send an email out and that can be distributed. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about Larry Walker and his work, I'll make that available. I think this is important to understand. Not so much, a lot of these things are things that develop in youth, but to understand the impact that schools have on youth, not only in the way that they maneuver through their adolescence, but the impact that has, again, not just on jobs and graduation rates and those things that we tend to measure, but also those things that we don't spend as much time measuring, which is moral courage. And yet I offer that it's measurable and it's difficult, hard science. It's hard to do, but it's measurable. And the people who are doing it are finding really incredible information that can help feed school leaders and educational leaders across all levels in their fight to try to generate enthusiasm and programs and money for programs like for moral education programs that can make a real impact. Okay, that was a bit of a bird walk about moral courage. I promise you we talked about failure. So let's spend some time talking about why do we fail? Well, if you think about the dilemmas that we talked about today, it's not difficult to bring to mind some examples of things that might lead us into failure. As we walk through the decision-making process, early on, there were issues of perception and interpretation. And at any step along that process, we are vulnerable to failure. Now, I'm a big believer that moral courage doesn't start with a dilemma landing in your lap. I mean, a leader is putting out fires all the time. Some of them are dilemmas, and some of them are just problems to solve and get rid of. But that's not when it begins. It begins with a much broader and holistic sense of how we prepare ourselves to go into a day. Now, some people will take this and I think maybe make light of it. And so I acknowledge that up front. I've heard critiques about this holistic approach to moral decision making. But I believe in it, and I think there's also some science to back it up. How much sleep you get the night before you go to work matters for being a good moral agent. How well fed you are when you go into a day matters for how you act as a good moral agent. How you've cleared the decks of emotional stress in your life matters. All of these, and I use the example that I know becomes a bit trite after a while because it's used a lot, but you know, when you're flying in an airplane and they say that if you're traveling with a young child and the air mask comes out, you're supposed to put the mask over your own head before trying to help anybody else. Well, the same is true for how we deal with our moral selves in our life. You have to take care of yourself. You have to put the mask over your own face. You have to get your own oxygen. I like that metaphor because I think it's important to breathe. It's important to find those moments in your life where you stop and you breathe. And it means you're relaxing and you're understanding the environment around you. You're connecting to the people that you're with. You're breathing at night, clearing the emotional stress out of your day so you can get a good night's sleep. So when you're hitting all those fires first thing at 8 o'clock in the morning, you're in a position to do something about it. You've already put the mask over your own face and you're ready to help other people. That's when moral agency begins. If you've put yourself under so much stress that you're not in a position to be helpful, then the perception and interpretation issues, those you can miss what's going on. But the other thing is when you get to issues of judgment and you get the issues of prioritizing your values, it's when you're weakest. And it matters. I'll give you a couple of examples of moral failure. If we were together in a traditional class, we would go through an exercise where I would ask you to share all of your, not all of them, but all of you would share some of your moral failures with us, which is a difficult assignment for people to do. Whenever I ask people that question, I always get people who say, I can't think of one. And I always tell them, you're not thinking hard enough. Because we all have them, and we've all had them pretty recently. So I'll share with you two. One I won't tell much about, and the other one I will. The first one I won't say much about was that when I think of moral failure, in the big picture, the sort of big defining moral failures, the ones that eat up a lot of my bandwidth, or at least did at times in my life, I think about the death of my own mother and how I was there at her bedside for months, and I was making decisions about how she was going to die. Now, I won't share much of that story, but those are, a lot of us have stories like that, those critical life events that really tested our mettle. And sometimes we succeeded, and sometimes we didn't, by a variety of different measures. And when we don't, sometimes that haunts us. But that doesn't have to be the moral failure that we think about when we're trying to process how we can do this better. I'll share another story with you, and this one I will tell you a little bit about. I have a young son. He's 2 years old next month. And when he was first born, I took a little bit of time off from work, and then I got back to work, and I had a lot of catching up to do. As many of you know, just because you took time off from work doesn't mean the work got done. So it's waiting for you when you get back. And so it was waiting for me when I get back. I was working very hard. I was home one day, and my son Jack was napping, and my wife was taking a nap because I was home. And I was on the couch, and I was getting some work done, and I heard Jack cry. Now, what do you think I did? Did I rush up and I go grab Jack right away before he kept crying and woke up my wife? I wish I had. I didn't. I waited. I waited until the second cry. With the second cry, my wife got up. Immediately in that moment, I knew I failed. Was it a big picture? Was it a big moral failure? Well, it was a moral failure because, just as I had said before, failure isn't doing what you think is right and having it turn out wrong. That's not moral failure. Moral failure is when you know what you should do. You know the right thing to do, and you don't do it. You do something else. Now, I knew I was tired and busy, but I knew my wife was more tired. And it was my turn, and I didn't take it. So I think about, I actually tell that story a lot. I think about it a lot. I've gotten a lot better at that. But the thing about it is that I process that, and I try to understand why. Why? It happened in the prioritization stage. In that moment, I prioritized my own, I was acting in my self-interest. I prioritized my own being tired, my own being busy, over an ethic of care, caring for the other people who were in that house at that time. And I got diverted. And even though I knew what the right thing to do was, that kind of pushed me. I reprioritized as I tried to leap the judgment action gap. So sometimes we can be overwhelmed by these priorities. That's one primary reason why we failed, is we're overwhelmed by all these competing interests that are pulling on us. Our own being tired, or money, the opportunity to have more money, the opportunity to have more power, or the opportunity to avoid conflict, and that might be one of the most common ones. That's why we fail. Another one has to do with distance and affiliation. Now, Dan Ariely is a behavioral economist who does some really interesting work on ethics, and he's got a great, he's done some great lectures on what he calls our buggy moral code. And if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to see him. And again, I'm happy to provide some resources after the fact to help direct you towards some of Dan Ariely's work. But Dan Ariely gives some really interesting examples, and he's done some of his own research on the importance of distance and affiliation and why we fail. I'll share with you a few examples. One of them is looking at college students and why they might cheat. And I know that any of you, all of you educators out there, you've come upon this. You've had students who cheated before, and it's interesting to think about how much they cheat and why they might cheat in different circumstances. He also is interested in why college students, that age, why they might steal and when they wouldn't. So here's a couple of examples he gave. One was where he set up an opportunity for students to take a test, and then they could take the test, and they would get paid based on how many answers they got correct. And they have one group of students that would just do the test, turn it in, they would get graded, and they would get paid $1 for every correct answer. And another group of students that took the test, then they could just rip up the test, put it in their backpack, just walk up to the person and tell them how many answers they got correctly. So the people who didn't actually have to show the test, do you think they cheated? And the answer is yes. They did. Those people actually, not much, but a little. Most of them cheated a little. He's trying to understand that a little bit more. He calls that the fudge factor. So he's trying to say, well, how can you grow the fudge factor, or can you make it smaller? So he started to look at other types of variations on this experiment. And one of them had to do with going to a university campus where there were two rival universities. And so he went to the campus, and he had the students sort of take a test, and then one person who immediately after getting the test would just stand up like 30 seconds later and say, I got them all right. And then go in and collect his money. Now, if that person was wearing the sweatshirt of the university where the test was being done, other people cheated. If that person was wearing the sweatshirt of the rival university, nobody cheated. So what does that tell us? It tells us that distance and affiliation matter. It tells us that affiliation with a person that we're watching them cheat matters. If we think that person's a good person, or we identify that person as a bad person, then we're more likely to either follow their behavior or not follow their behavior. He also did a study on distance and cheating, where he put a plate of cash in a refrigerator. And then he put 6 packs of Cokes in a refrigerator. Now, for any of you who worked in an office with a common kitchen, you can imagine how long the Cokes last. Eventually, they all disappeared. People came in, they stole the Cokes. Nobody ever stole a plate of cash. Nobody ever stole even one of those dollars. Now, if they had, they could have taken it to the Coke machine right down the hall, and they could have bought a Coke. So sometimes the distance matters. He's done other work with, would people cheat for tokens that they could turn in for dollars, or would they cheat for dollars more? And people cheat for the tokens more than they cheat for the dollars. Distance matters. Distance in affiliation that we feel from other people we see doing that behavior, or distance from the actual object of our desires. A token, the dollar itself, affects whether we're likely to actually fail morally or not. And these types of behaviors play themselves out over and over again. All right. So the other question is, why do we keep failing? Now I'm going to tell you about another study, and this one has nothing to do with cheating. It has to do with relationships. And it actually doesn't have to do anything to do with moral behavior, but I think it matters for understanding why we keep failing. There's a study that was done actually here at the University of Arkansas in the psych department, where they were looking at single people, the people who are not in relationships. And they asked them, what are the kinds of things, what are the characteristics that you would look for in a relationship? And they would gather data on that. Then they interviewed them and said, well, what are the kinds of things you would absolutely not accept in a relationship? That if a person exhibited these traits, you would absolutely refuse to be in a relationship with them. Well, so they recorded that. And then they followed up. And so they came back a year later, and they found people who were in the original study who were now in a relationship. and they asked them to describe that person. Now, can anybody guess, as you're thinking about this, as they describe that person, how closely they matched with the person that they said they were looking for? Not at all. Christy's right. In fact, most of them, and they self-reported this, so it's not like it was just they went out and met this person and then tried to figure out what they were like. Not at all. Beyond, they not only didn't exhibit the things they were looking for, they did exhibit the things they said they would not accept under any circumstances. Well, that was curious. So they asked, well, now listen, before you said that you wouldn't ever be with somebody who was like this, this, and this. Now you're telling us that the person you're with is like this, this, and this. What happened? What do you think their response is? And I do want you to text your answers into this. God, love, yeah. Some people did talk about love. They will change. Yeah. 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 Well, those are some of the things. Keep typing. As I'm talking, keep typing these in. So it's interesting that while some people mention love, nobody mentioned that they will change. Nobody mentioned that opposites attract. Yeah. That would make sense, right? That they would say those types of things. And that's what makes this study so interesting. They said that the researcher was wrong. They said that that's not what they said. They didn't say that they wouldn't accept people like that.
I really like that.
They completely reconstructed their reality to fit their behavior. Now think about that for a minute. They completely reconstructed their own belief system, their own reality, their own sense of what had happened. It didn't happen. I never said that. But it's right here in the transcript. I'll show it to you. You misheard me. They were locked in steadfast in that moment that they were wrong. That's not, they didn't mean it. They meant something else. So what's happening here is that when that dissonance occurs, when people were faced with that brutal dissonance between what they believed and what they actually did, they didn't say, oh, I'm doing the wrong thing. They said, no, I believed the wrong thing. Or worse yet, I've never believed it, and you're wrong for telling me that I did. Well, beyond just being fascinating to me, I think it's incredibly relevant to how we learn about our own moral failures. When we're faced with that kind of incredible dissonance, the idea that we're more likely to reconstruct our past belief system to match our behaviors, that it's easier for us to do that than it is to change our behavior to match our belief system, is why we keep failing. It's never engaging in that metacognitive process. Now, that's not to say that we all do that. We all do it all the time. Some people have become quite accomplished at dealing with this better. But many people in this study actually did report that. And I think that if you look at that, it's not so uncommon to see in our own lives that we reconstruct our belief system to fit the reality that we're in. Thank you for sharing that, Susan. I'll be interested to look that up. If you're looking at the text, a similar story on eating disorders. I mean, engaging in the metacognitive reflective process, engaging in that thinking about our own thinking matters. Being aware of how we are prone to do that, I think, is helpful. But the other critical issue is just to know that as we continue to evolve, if we don't ever accept that we're failing, if failure is so not an option, that we have to keep changing our own worldview to fit the reality that we're in, we can never really evolve as moral agents. That's why I think it's critically important to actually use failure in our own lives on a regular basis. There's another thing I want to talk about, and this will be gearing towards the end where I'll open up some Q&A, and that's this idea of expert regression. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the term expert regression. I've used it a little bit in my writing, and I've seen it a few other places, but it's not a common term. So as we get better at developing a worldview or developing our expertise in our jobs, we often begin to replace effective with efficient. And I'll just talk about that a little bit more. So people who are good at solving problems, and people problems particularly, when somebody walks into your office and they have a problem, if you've been in the business for a long time, you're pretty good at diagnosing that problem and identifying a solution. And you may jump the gun when you see somebody coming in into your office and start to assume things about why they're there. There's a great way to think about these different problem solvers, and one of them is to think about them as there's a scale that's in the literature about being a reactionary, a manager, or an initiator. I don't know if you've come across this at all in your own reading, but a really great example about a school superintendent that's in the literature, and it talks about this the superintendent who has a problem that they have to deal with. They take over a district, and they see that there's some things they want to get cleaned up, and they delegate up to a principal, and the principal has to take care of some of these issues in these buildings. So the principal's looking around, they see a lot of problems, and one of the problems they have is that they've got a window that's painted over. So the principal's looking at the windows that's painted over, and they say, well, I've got to get that fixed. And so they call up, there's a district, it's a big district, and the district has a department of painting. Part of their maintenance is their painters. And so he calls that group, and he says, well, I got this paint on this window I need to get taken off. And the painter said, I'm sorry, we don't take paint off. We just paint things. We can't help it. Okay. So they say, well, they call the maintenance people to fix things. They say, well, I got this window. The painters can't help me. I got this window. It's got this paint on it. I got to get the paint taken off. Can you help me? And then they say, no, I'm sorry. We don't take paint off. We just fix things when they're broken. So okay, the maintenance people can't help them, and the painters can help. So what do you think the principal does? Any ideas? Oh, a few people were typing. Absolutely, breaks the window. Yeah. So so there's this way of, this is an initiator. This is that way of sort of, they've moved beyond expert regression. The expert regression is that there's certain ways that I can solve problems, and I'm so used to solving them this way, they tend to be the right way to solve them, and then I'm just going to stay within that box. And the person who's able to move beyond expert regression and see outside is able to say, okay, great, they literally just shattered the window, and they called maintenance, said, I got a broken window, come over and fix it, they replace it and put in the window we wanted. The same thing happens with moral failure. Oftentimes we see problems coming up over and over and over again, and we develop certain ways to solve them. And we become efficient at it, and so efficient that maybe we stop to see how we can use the broader spectrum of rules that exist out there to create a better solution, a more nuanced solution that actually gets us where we want to be, as opposed to just a rule-following solution that just fits within the box that we've lived in. And I'm also happy to share that research with the group as well. There's a book and there are a few articles. It's a professor out of UNL who's done some research on management styles and how it fits into moral problem solving. So that's sort of the capstone I want to put on my talk today before I start to field some Q&A, is that moral failure matters, and that it's more than just thinking about the should of what we should do when we're dealt with moral dilemmas, that it's critically important to think about the how we reason through problems, and to accept that we're going to have failures every day. Our students are going to have failures every day. And that if we can take the time ourselves and take the time with those people that we've been charged with helping in these helping professions, to embrace those moments of failure as opportunities to grow, but provide the kind of scaffolding they need to actually do the growing, that we can make tremendous progress as moral agents in building a moral community around us. So that's my talk for the day, and the balance of time is available for some Q&A. I'm happy to have it dialogue with you. As you have questions, please send them. Oh, yeah. Well, Constance, there actually is. I mean, there are some fairly strict codes of ethics that surround moral research, and there's a lot of moral research that was done in the past that, frankly, we could never do now. I mean, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Stanford prison experiment, for example, and you know, several others that have to do with how we respond to social pressures and things that came out of the 60s, early 70s. And it's interesting that we have those studies now to draw upon, but it'd be difficult to replicate under our current ethics standard. Oh, good. I get asked this question a lot, particularly in reference to ethics. So how do I see the difference between morality and ethics? I see morality as that psychological cognitive process that we go through when we're dealing with moral problems, and the morality itself could be defined, you know, sort of structurally, like socially, but ethics I look at sort of that codification of society's moral beliefs. So that's why you see code of ethics for organizations. You don't see a code of morals. So code of ethics is when people have come together and they've agreed that culturally and socially, these are the things that we agree. These are the parts of our moral code that we kind of believe we should all agree upon and we should all strive to follow. Well, that morality has to do with how we ourselves wrestle with those instances of trying to balance competing good. And really, moral dilemmas are not about good and bad, although that's part of it, but it's really about competing goods that we have to try to wrestle with and choose which good is the best good. The best good for ourselves, for the broader society, for the people who are immediately in that situation. And I mean, even when you think about the question of killing, I mean, we did that in this talk today, that it's not, you know, killing is bad and preserving life is good. Well, we make choices as a society and individually all the time that challenge that very simplistic assumption about what many people consider our most prime moral belief, which is the value of human life. There was a question from Kim, relationship with moral failure and identifying with covert dimensions. Well, Kim, why don't you help me out there a little bit? And I think I know what you're talking about when you say covert dimensions, but if you could flesh that out for me a little bit, let me come back to that question. Yeah, I mean, morality to some extent is ethics is the community contract. I think that's a good way to say it. Morality is the personal contracts. Sure, yeah, I mean, I think so, but I think it also includes this very broad kind of, I mean, it's our relationships with others too. I mean, there's the community contract that's codified, and there's the community contract that we accept into ourselves, and that's part of our own moral agency, I think. Do you think people, okay, do you believe that it's possible to get people to move beyond the norms and accept that deep-seated change is possible? Well, I kind of have to, since I'm in this business. And I say that sort of as a leap of faith. But let me get beyond that, Annette, and talk about beyond the leap of faith. Do I think that the research plays out that deep-seated change is possible? I do. But I also believe that that you don't successfully change behaviors by just changing the way people think. I think that it's easier to change the way people think by changing, and that you have to include some combination of those things. Now, there's an example I like to use when I talk about this, and it has to do with how we got people to quit smoking. So there have been a lot of reflection and research by sociologists around this phenomenon. So when communities were trying to deal with the dangers of smoking and secondhand smoking and the health risks that they cause, there's a lot of public information that and try to talk about the dangers of smoking, and to create lots of really coarse images in people's minds and associate that with smoking and try to turn people off to it. And it had pretty minimal effect. And then people took a different tack, and they actually changed behaviors. They started to pass smoking ordinances within buildings, within certain, feet of breezeways and entryways into buildings, restaurants, and so on. Tobacco-free environments all around. And as they did that, they were modifying people's behaviors. It was more difficult to smoke in social circumstances. And just as I talked about before, there's as you change people's behaviors, they will modify their thinking. That's kind of manipulating the process that we're trying to change. But as people's behaviors are forced to change, they will modify their own reasoning and their belief system, and that has a stronger impact. Now, you piggyback along that some rationalization. You help them by rationalizing that smoking is in fact bad for you, and you don't want to do it. It's frowned upon, and then they use that rationalization to reconstruct their own reality and their own belief system around smoking, and then you get a much stronger response. Not a 100% response, but a stronger response. Now that's one example of a process that I think gives hope to abandoning habits and accepting a broader, deep-seated change. I think the same thing could be true of deeper moral issues that we face as a society. I'm going to go back and read this next one. This is from Constance. I do emergency response. This training sets the moral ethical standard during disaster. Do the most good for the most people. This means that in passing a heavily damaged house in an earthquake, and we hear people calling for help, we note the situation and move on to rescue those who will not endanger our lives. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting comment. I think that it wasn't really so much a question as a comment, but I just want to reflect on it. I think that, this comes up in all kinds of situations where we're pressed to make a decision when we're balancing, again, two competing goods. And utilitarian arguments are are valid. I mean, in philosophy, we kind of start with utilitarian arguments, and then we move past them, and we say they're primitive, and we should look beyond utility. And I don't know what your philosophical background is, but if you study Rawls at all and his theory of justice, Rawls would contend that utility actually within a context matters. It's just that it's not just utility for the individual, but it's utility for the entire society. And so he still weaves utilitarian arguments, these very nuanced ideas about how we can grow, evolve ourselves, expand our own individual good, and still expand the good for others, with a caveat that it's important to also expand the good for those who are the least advantaged within a society, and how those play out in moments of severe crisis like emergency responders. Those have to be habit formed. Those have to be something that's kind of drilled into you. Because in the moment, you don't necessarily have time to wrestle all those things to the ground. I talk all the time that I like to talk about habits. I like to talk about things that are practical because, people aren't referencing Locke and Rawls in their head when they're dealing with an emergency crisis. It's not how people solve problems. Is morality and value the same things? Also, with all the various types of school violence that's happening, how do we attack these moral failures and these behaviors? Well, I think values sort of make up our moral selves, but there are lots of things that we value. That when we value money, and we value personal safety, and we value things that are frankly quite hedonistic as well, very self-serving, and those contribute to our broader moral landscape. So that's how I would think about it. And types of school violence is happening. How do we attack these moral behaviors? I think that I always try to teach issues of school violence from a community perspective. I think that generally there are lots of components within schools that could be addressed that could have an impact on moral behavior. There's a great journal out of NC State, Journal of School Violence, which often touches upon these broader moral issues. That may be a good reference for you to think about these things. But how do we think about the child's role within their own community? Are we putting them in a position where they have great voice or very little voice? And I think that matters on two fronts. One, I think that when you think about setting community standards, setting community behavior, if it's just imposed on children from others, from adults, from a book, a guidebook, it's very difficult for them to be invested in it themselves. I'll tell you a story from my own student handbook when I was in high school. I just told the story in class last week. When we got into, if we were to get into a fight, our student handbook told us that we were supposed to say, and there was a quote we were supposed to use, "I do not want to fight. It is against school rules." I just want you to imagine that. Imagine that moment that there's a crowd of people around you, there's somebody who's about to punch you in the face, and then you have to say, "I do not want to fight. It is against school rules." Well, I mean, that's not the reason that we want kids not to fight. And by the way, I used that line once when I got out of a fight because everybody's laughing so hard we all walked away. But, we don't want kids to not fight because it's against school rules. We want kids not to fight because they value not fighting. They value mutual gain negotiation. We want them to value these nuanced ways of interacting with each other that we hope they'll use as adults. And engaging them in the process, a more democratic process within their own environment, in those schools, is the best way to help them understand those nuanced values. But the other thing is that by bringing them into that conversation early on, you're addressing the bystanders who are watching. What is the community standard within a school for school violence? And I'm not just talking about the fight that breaks out in the hallways, but also the bullying that happens in school, online, that spills into broader school violence, the kind that we see on CNN. All these types of issues, there are bystanders at every step of the way. There are bystanders online. There are bystanders in the hallway. And what's the community standard for what those bystanders do next? Not only as a conduit of information to the adults to help scaffold what they can do with the problem, but also to understand that that they may be their role to intervene, to establish some community standard of behavior, to protect those who can't protect themselves. I just don't think that's the kind of thing you can teach through a handbook or you can lecture to a kid. You can't lecture democracy. You can't lecture moral relation with each other. You have to practice it. You have to build the habit. And you have to do it with adults around so that when adults aren't around, they've had some practice with it and they have something to tap into themselves. That might be a way more complicated or bigger answer than you were looking for, but that's how I feel about it, and that's how I teach it to our school leaders here. Yeah, Christy, right. I mean, going back to what you were saying before, Christy, yes, the earlier comment about the oxygen mask. Exactly. It's just like the oxygen mask. Okay, this is from James. In Moral Minds, Mark Hauser affirms that our minds are designed so that there can be a universal sense of right and wrong. More recently, Sam Harris in The Moral Landscape affirms that science can determine human values and ethics. Both of these lead to the thesis that morality can transcend culture and become universal. That's a great question. Yes. No, I'm just kidding. I'll give you a better answer. Do I think that morality can transcend cultures and become universal? Yes, but I'm going to give you caveats. So I think that there is something behind.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh, we've lost him.
Yeah, we've lost him.
Constance?
Oh, it's just we've lost the sound.
I asked if he hit the mute button.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Boy, I just gave the most brilliant answer to that question.
Well, Constance and I heard you.
Great. Back me up on this, right? All right, I'll go back. I'm assuming you missed the whole answer, so.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'll go back to the beginning. All right, so the I think that there's a lot actually in the behavioral neuroscience research, and I think there's a lot in our cross-cultural, sociological, anthropological research. There's a lot that tells us, informs us that that the human animal seems to be hardwired with a certain capacity for moral agency. But we also know that moral agency, it looks different across time, and it looks different across cultures. There are some common components but it looks different. And so I want to be really clear about that. There are two ways to think about this. One way is to think about it is, do humans have this sort of transcendent capacity for morality? I think the answer to that seems to be a resounding yes. But is there a transcendent, from a philosophical standpoint, the should? Is there a transcendent should code that we all buy into, or we all should buy into? And that's the question that people have been rattling around and trying to figure out for thousands of years. So what do I think about both of those? I mean, I do think that there's a capacity for morality. I think that what's core about that morality is often driven by social and cultural mores. I think that we go back to the trolley dilemma. We value, when we're doing the calculus around how we value human life, we value it differently. And then we have, again, not just across cultures now, but across time. We've had very different value structures around not just those people that are closest to us, but people that are farther away from us. And that continues to evolve. It's for the philosophers to determine the should behind that. But I do believe in a transcendent moral agency, and then within that moral agency is then shaped by community, and it's shaped by culture, and it's shaped by our own individual experiences. And you put them all together and you develop ethical code that our morality works within. I think that the fundamental question, and here's the one I'm going to actually just bail out on, but I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to try to be soft about it, I'm going to tell you I don't know. And that's that, if you accept Kohlberg's theories about stages of moral development, and you look at those highest stages, those most evolved stages of development, one question would be, do we believe that at that highest, that in no matter your culture, no matter your time, if you've evolved to that highest stage of moral agency within your culture, would there be a common thought? Would there be a common approach, a common belief system? And I don't know. It's a great question, but I put myself in the illustrious group of scholars and the common everyday thinkers all around the planet for thousands of years who haven't been able to figure that one.